Hello loves and welcome to today's video. The Goodreads Choice Awards nominees for the first round came out last week, and I was looking through the list, and even though I've read like 35 different 2024 releases this year, only I think 10 of those ended up getting nominated for the Goodreads Choice Awards, and also 2 DNFs ended up being nominated. So I decided instead of doing a video on that, I would instead focus on what I did read and give you my rankings of the 2024 releases. To be clear, these are all things released actually in this calendar year. I did not include the ones that were released tail end of 2023. I know the Goodreads Choice Awards considers those, but figuring out what did and did not contend, too much work. Wasn't gonna do it. Also, I've left out graphic novels in this. It's not even a category anymore in the Goodreads Choice Awards, and ranking those in comparison to an actually fully fleshed out novel didn't seem fair. So these are the definitive list of my ranking of the 2024 releases that I have read. In the bottom spot, we have Obitchuary by Spencer Henry. This is a nonfiction book about death, and it goes into different aspects of death, like funeral rites, about burials, about vampires, I think, and necrophilia. This was just such a shallow book in terms of the information that it provided. I know it's spawned off by a podcast, and it very much had the trying to capitalize on our popularity as a podcast to make some extra money vibes to it. So there's definitely better books about death out there. I think like Stiff by Mary Rowe. I think I've read other books about death that did this topic a lot more in depth, a lot more interestingly. So that one is the lowest rating of a 2.5. Also at a 2.5, next up is Middle of the Night by Riley Sager. This is Riley Sager's latest thriller, and I think his first one that's written from the perspective of a man. Middle of the Night is about this man who is moving back into his childhood home after leaving his hometown. One of the reasons that he so adamantly left behind his hometown was because when he was a child, his best friend was like kidnapped out of his backyard. When he returns to his home, he kind of hears the voice and thinks he sees his friend who was kidnapped. He kind of investigates what happened, whether he's seeing ghosts, and try and solve the disappearance of his friend. I don't think this was very well written. I think that the plot twist was the most boring option we could have gone with. It tried to do Stranger Things, but Stranger Things in a more boring way. So 2.5 for Middle of the Night. Next we have The Warm Hands of Ghosts, which got a 2.5, and I need to preface this with, this book was not for me, like at all. I went into it expecting like a gothic horror book, expecting something mystical, because it is nominated in the fantasy category, and I will say that nothing fantastical happened until like 60% of the way in. This book is mostly about the horrors of World War I and the Halifax explosion, I guess. This is about a woman whose brother is declared missing in action during the war, but she receives a package in the mail that has both of his dog tags and his clothing, and she's like, how did he go missing in action, presumed dead, if we have his clothes? Like, what happened here? So she finds a way to go back to the front, which she was a nurse in the war who was injured and had been sent back. So she goes back to Europe in the midst of the war to try and find out what happened to her brother, and you get both her perspective and her brother's perspective of like where he currently is, and there is a little bit of a fantasy element to it, but it's so bare bones. I don't think this qualifies as a fantasy. I think this is more a World War I novel, and I don't like books about the World War. So I was bamboozled into reading this. It got a 2.5. I'm sure if those are more your thing, those kinds of books, maybe you would enjoy this. The writing style was pretty decent, just not gonna be my plot. Not my era. Historical fiction is already kind of dicey for me depending on which era we're talking about, and this is just the worst possible one for me. Next 2.5, we have Nightmare of a Trip by Maureen Kilmer. This is about a woman who is going on a road trip with her family to go to an amusement park in Florida. While they are driving, they run into this creepy old house where her son like picks up and lock it, and then the locket has a ghost attached to it, and they end up bringing a ghost on their little road trip with them. This could have been an interesting concept, except for me, it focused a lot on like the trials and tribulations of motherhood, because spoilers from here, If you don't want spoilers for this novel, go on ahead. This focused on her being pregnant with another child, where she like one day is like, ooh, I keep getting sick in the morning. I wonder what it could be. And then 20% of the book, I think maybe I should take a test. And then 20% of the book, I took a test and it's positive, but I don't want to tell my husband. 20% of the book, I finally told my husband and like, he was chill about it. So much of that, and I hate accidental pregnancy. I hate when it's like, oh, I feel sick for some mysterious reason, and don't bother to think of and go and test for the most obvious thing it could have been. Was so annoyed with this. I liked Suburban Hell a lot more than this one, but still wasn't great. So I think Maureen Kilmer just focuses on like that age demographic that I am never going to be a part of, which is middle-aged mothers. Next book is Youth Juice. This is about a woman who gets a job at this trendy skincare company, and she has access to this new product called Youth Juice, and in her past traumatic things have caused her to have a lot of scarring on her hands, and this magical new product completely cleans up her scarring. She no longer has the urge to pick at her skin, and the product has kind of a dark side to its development. This one kept rushing through the parts of the narrative that made it really interesting. It brought up the concept of like interns are going missing. I wonder what that's connected to. And then just moving on to our character rambling about her friend and who's not her friend. And we had an interesting concept. We didn't do anything with it. As I mentioned in my monthly wrap up, I also read this book the same weekend I went to see The Substance, which, while not an exact parallel, is a similar enough concept, which actually did lean into a bit more of the beauty standards that women are held to and the extreme lengths they'll go and all of those things. This one just couldn't execute on the idea, in my opinion, so that one got a 2.75. We then have a 3-star, The Greatest Nobodies of History by Adrienne Bliss. Adrienne Bliss is a TikToker who's known for doing historical skits of like, what would the perspective of one of the people watching Noah load the Ark be? And kind of those side characters that definitely existed, but we never really see the perspective of. So this goes through, I think, 10 different stories and periods of history, explaining the perspective of different aspects of it. Some of them were a bit more straightforward, like the assistant of the stool to King Henry VIII, which was a real position, and that chapter was based on actual journal entries. And then we had ones where it's like the perspective of the germ that causes the Black Plague. Some of these were interesting. That Black Plague one, the Henry VIII one particularly, I liked. A lot of the other ones just went on way too long, like way too long. It works in a snappy TikTok. It does not work in a like 40-page story, and got a little grating, a little repetitive. So this gets a 3-star. I did appreciate that Adrian, whoever wrote it, I don't know if he wrote himself or his ghostwritten, each chapter would kind of start setting the scene, and then at the end of the chapter it would have like, here's the actual historical basis for what this story was. Found these documents from Henry VIII's assistant of the stool. We found these documents that were locked up in the Vatican for so long and were unearthed when they did renovations in 1967. Oh, I appreciated the effort it took to provide the historical context and the historical basis for a lot of them. I just couldn't get into most of the stories, and they just went on really long for me. Next we have Someone You Can Build a Nest In by John Wiswell. This one got a 3.25. This is a fantasy fairy tale about this giant worm creature who's being hunted, and to try and escape from the hunters, they turn themselves into a human that's kind of not quite right, and they end up falling in love with a woman in the nearest village, and so they're trying to conceal themselves as a creature while falling in love. This one had a really cool writing style to it. It had that like grim fairy tale style to it. I just couldn't get into the story in this one. I wasn't enjoying the characters as much as I wanted to, so this one, 3.25. I know other people will enjoy it, wasn't for me. Next, we have The Age of Magical Overthinking by Amanda Montell, also at 3.25. This is kind of a memoir essay collection about the kind of anxiety that social media and being in certain social groups gives you. It talked about stan culture a little bit. I read Cultish and I liked that one a bit better. This one kept like skirting around having legitimate sources of like, oh yeah, I was talking to my friend who happens to be a therapist and they said this. I'm like, well, was it an interview or was it just like you were having coffee with this person and it's not actually their professional opinion? Tonally was a little bit off for me, where it skirted the line between being a casual reflection on the way the author personally feels about things, also trying to bring in experts' opinions. Next we have You Know What You Did. I filmed a plot summary and in editing I realized the plot summary was wrong. I misremembered that book. This one is about a woman whose mother has recently died and her mother kind of held over her head something that happened when she was younger, so there's hints as to what this terrible thing she might have done in her past is, and while she is coping with the fact that her mother has died, she thinks things are a little bit off in her house, things keep moving around, and she kind of develops OCD as a way to cope with all of these stressful things that are going on in her life. I didn't really think that the thing that happened in her past was dramatic enough to be held over her head to that effect. It's a bit about abusive parenthood. I just couldn't get into this one as a thriller. Last 3.25 is Fang Fiction. This is a fantasy romance about a woman who finds out that the vampire story series that she has been obsessed with for years is actually true, and all of the characters are real and have just been kind of isolated in this parallel island. Her and her former best friend from college, one of them is stuck in New York and has to help one of the vampires get back to the island, and one is trapped on the island and trying to get back to Manhattan, and both of the ones fall in love with the respective vampire that they're trying to help. This one had a lot going on. I can definitely see that this was kind of a love letter to those who grew up with vampire fiction like Twilight, like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, but I don't think it executed it particularly expertly. Definitely a funner, lighter read, just not as well fleshed out as something else that's going to be on this list later. Next are the books at 3.5. First is The Husbands by Holly Gramazio. This is about a woman who is single, and she comes home from a party one night, a little tipsy, and there's a man in her house who's claiming to be her husband. And then she sends him into the attic for some reason, and he comes back out and it's a different person who's also now their husband. So they find out that every time they send this new partner into the attic, they change into a different husband, and all of the different little micro changes in her life that would lead her to meeting this person and being in a relationship with them. This one had a very interesting concept. I was enjoying particularly when she meets the other person who has been experiencing the same thing, but pacing wise it got really repetitive, and every once in a while it'd be like, oh yeah, I just went through 25 husbands and now I'm with this one. I'm like, okay. And that happened several times throughout the book, and I don't think it had a satisfying ending for what it was trying to say. So that one got a 3.5. It was well written, it had an interesting concept, I just don't think it executed the ending spectacularly. Next we have How to Solve Your Own Murder. This is about a woman whose great aunt is just convinced that someone's gonna murder her, and was told this by a fortune teller at the age of 16, and has spent the next 50 something years trying to solve her own murder based on this fortune. So when the great aunt does eventually die, the woman has to go to this small town to try and figure out who did it to be able to have the inheritance. So she is fighting against a couple other people to solve the murder first. So we have parallel stories of trying to solve the great aunt's current situation, and also what happened when the aunt was 16 and why she had a falling out with some of her friends. The characters were so hard to keep track of. They were so hard to even know how old they were, because at one point, I did this for a book club, at one point someone in the book club was like, I thought that character was 60. You're telling me they're supposed to be in their 30s? The mystery made no sense. It was like there were 15 people total living in this town, even though that doesn't realistically make sense. It was a little messy. So 3.5, some aspects of the story were interesting. I would have preferred a focus on some of the like past stuff, but once you try to look at the actual plot, the holes start showing up. Next book is Kilt Trip. This one was a while ago, so give me a second. I think this one was about a woman who works at a travel agency, and she goes on a trip to Scotland to like try and help this tour agency pick up their business, and the son of the guy who owns the business is not particularly receptive to her ideas, and he tries to like show her the true heart of Scotland, where she is like, no, like that's not gonna make money. How do we make money? Scottish romance. It was all right. I enjoyed some aspects of it. I think if I remember correctly, I didn't particularly like the female main character, but some of the descriptions of the scenery and Scotland were very beautiful. Next book is Nightwatching by Tracy Sierra. This is about a woman who is at home with her 2 small kids when someone breaks into her house, and she has to hide in the walls to try and escape this man who broke into her home. That is the setup premise of the first half of the book. About halfway through, the narrative switches to where she has now escaped this ordeal, and the police just don't believe her that it happened, so she is second-guessing her own experience of the events as to the evidence that the police is finding that it wasn't true. This one I was with in the first half, and then it did that little switch of just like, this is about gaslighting now, actually. I didn't quite like that as much. It wasn't executed very well, so 3.5 for that. Then we have Wrath of the Triple Goddess by Rick Riordan. So this is the second book in the Percy Jackson Senior Years adventure. In this one, Percy is having to do favors for gods to get reference letters to go to college, and he is tasked by the goddess Hecate to pets it, and her pets are a hellhound and it's not a ferret, they make a polecat that was formerly a witch and was turned into a polecat. And of course they escape, and Percy has to try and track them down across New York City. I don't think this is the strongest Percy Jackson series. They are a lot lower stakes than the previous ones, where it's like, yeah, the stake is that he's not going to get to go to college. So these are definitely a lot lighter. It's 3.5 because I just expect more from Rick Riordan, given how much I love the original Percy Jackson series and then the follow-up Heroes of Olympus one. Acknowledging these are for middle grade people, so they're not for me as a 30-year-old, but 3.5 for it overall. I did enjoy how the narrative resolved in this one, just not as high stakes as I wanted. Next book is This Skin Was Once Mine by Eric LaRocca. This is a short story collection in the horror genre. There were some of the stories in this I liked more than others, particularly the one in this collection that stood out to me was a man who develops a fetish for putting glass in his skin. I thought that one was really interesting. Also the titular story about a woman who has a falling out with her mother at a young age and goes no contact with her mother while still keeping contact with her father, and then when her father dies she has to go back to take care of affairs for her mother who is bedridden, and the reveal of that story, very interesting. 3.5 overall. Some of the other stories in this collection were just a little weaker. And oh look, the first of this collection that I own, 3.5 for Leather and Lark as well. This is the sequel to Butcher and Blackbird. It is about Lark, who is a famous singer and also a multiple deleter, and it is enemies to lovers romance with the brother from the first book, who is like a cleanup guy for the mafia. So they met when she was younger, and he helped clean up and cover for one of her murders, and was kind of just each of them being a dick to each other. And then they meet later when they're adults without realizing that it's the same person, and start falling for each other, and then they realize, and all this complicated stuff. And then there's also like someone hunting them because her family is being targeted by some rival killer. This book probably only got as high as it did because those are all the times it mentions Keanu Reeves, and I am a Keanu Reeves fan. Definitely not as strong as the first one. It takes itself a bit too seriously. I felt like the original Butcher and Blackbird had this like tongue-in-cheek we know what we're doing, not taking this seriously, whereas this one tried to take itself a bit too seriously, so that one got a 3.5. Last 3.5 is The House That Horror Built by Christina Henry. This is about a woman who gets a job cleaning houses for this eccentric horror director, and he has displays in his house of props and costumes from some of his horror movies. And the woman who is the house cleaner thinks that one of these props has started moving. And there's also a mystery going on that this director's wife and son disappeared. This one got a 3.5 because I was enjoying the plot, I was enjoying the side characters, but I hated being in the head of the main character. She had such extreme levels of anxiety and was just like thinking constantly about what could go wrong and all of this stuff. It was exhausting to read from. Also, this happens like during COVID, so that came up. I like a little bit of escapism to pretend that didn't happen and is not currently still happening, even though everybody's pretending it's not. Anyway, 3.5 for this one. Good plot, exhausting character. Next book is Whoever You Are, Honey. This is about two women who live in the same neighborhood. One has lived in this like old beaten down house for years, and then this new woman with a tech bro husband moves in, gentrifying the neighborhood, and the unlikely friendship that those two develop as they are kind of questioning who they are, how they fit into the world. And there's a little bit of a science fiction element to this as the new neighbor kind of questions whether or not she's real or not, because she has zero memories before she basically married her husband, whereas the one who's been in the neighborhood for a while is haunted by a memory she can't forget. It's about the nature of memory, the nature of regret, and a little bit of a sci-fi Black Mirror twist to it. This got a 3.5. It was well written. I enjoyed some of the plot line. I think that just the one particularly with the sci-fi element didn't go far enough and left a little bit too ambiguous for my taste. I don't mind an ambiguous ending, but it seemed to be ambiguous in a blunt way and not ambiguous in a provoking of thought way. Next 3.5 is Diavola by Jennifer Thorne, I think. This one is about a woman who's going to a vacation in Italy in a villa with her family. And when they get there, all the townspeople are kind of like, you're staying in that villa? Are you sure you want to do that? And like trying to hand her good luck charms and stuff. So obviously that villa's haunted and the ghost starts showing up, making problems for her. This one had such a slow start to it and her family was so annoying the whole time. But then at the end, it reveals why they were being annoying and it also picks up the pace quite a bit. So 3.75 for some, little light pacing issues, but otherwise it was decent narrative. Also 3.75, we have The Last Murder at the End of the World by Stuart Turton. This one is about a kind of bubble that contains the last humans because there was like a fog or a plague of bugs that basically destroyed everything it went through, and the only people who survived were people on this island protected by this bubble. And then the person responsible for bringing the bubble up is murdered, and part of the condition of the safety protocol for this bubble is that if she is murdered, the bubble comes down unless they can basically figure out why she died. So they're trying to desperately solve the murder while trying to survive with this rapidly shrinking bubble that's her last refuge of safety. This one goes like a lot of really weird places. I did enjoy it. It just was not as good as I was expecting after reading The 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle. It didn't live up to that one. It had some pretty unique takes and interesting elements of technology. Still would recommend it, 3.75. Next we have Here We Go Again by Alison Cochrane. This is a romance novel about two childhood best friends. Both of them are girls, and they had a huge falling out because one of them has been like an out lesbian, and then they have a kiss, and then the one who's not out goes and kisses a boy, and the girl who's out feels spurned, so they have this huge falling out and they hate each other and they're angry at each other. And then when they are adults, their favorite high school English teacher has cancer and is dying and calls both of them up and is like, hey, I want to go on a road trip from wherever they are to Maine. So Logan, who is the like out and proud lesbian, she is the more spontaneous one, and then the other woman is a planner, so their personality types clash as they try and fulfill the final wish of their mentor who's dying of cancer. The romance in this one was definitely like the least interesting part of it. I enjoyed the parts of this that was more about the queer joy of an elderly gay man who lived through the AIDS crisis, who had to live in a time where people were not quite as accepting. I thought those elements of the plot were a lot more interesting than the actual romance. The romance wasn't bad in my opinion, but definitely preferred the English teacher Joe and his storyline to the actual romance I was supposed to be focusing on, so it's a little distracting to have the side characters be more interesting. Next is the books at 4 stars, so we're getting into the really good ones now. First we have Keanu Reeves Is Not in Love with You. This is a nonfiction book about the fake romance dating scams where you'll have a celebrity slide into the DMs and be like, hey, I saw you're a fan of me, let me fly you out, but oh wait, my manager can't know, so you send the money and I'll buy the ticket, and basically scams people out of money. And she goes into a lot of how people prey on vulnerable people very specifically, how people can fall for it, how they work in different ways, how they get your information to be able to more accurately scam you. And also she shares throughout the book some trolling she does of the fake Keanu Reeves that are in her DMs. I only picked this up obviously because Keanu Reeves is in the cover, clearly. I enjoyed this one a lot. It's obviously written more from a layman than an expert, and I think it could have benefited from a bit more inclusion of some expert opinions, but definitely a really interesting read. Really important topic to discuss so that less people fall victim to these types of scams. And speaking of Keanu Reeves, the book of Elsewhere by Keanu Reeves and China Millville. This is written by China, based on Keanu Reeves's universe for the Berserker comic book series. This is about our main character B, who is this immortal being, and he has teamed up with this paramilitary group and basically sometimes just goes into a berserker mode and kills everyone around him. So because he's immortal, he's the ultimate weapon. And then one day they're on a mission in a sewer, and some pig comes in that is also immortal. So how'd the pig get in the sewer? What's it doing there? Who put it there? That's what we're going to investigate, while also having a little bit of a philosophical ponderings and discussions about the nature of immortality, the nature of grief, what it's like to outlive the people in your life that you love. This definitely didn't end up being what I would have expected it to be based on the comics, where it focuses a bit more on the him killing everyone in a room all the time. But I still did really enjoy it. I think it had some really interesting points about immortality and grief. And there were also these different sections where it's different people who had known B throughout different centuries. So there was a little bit of change up in the writing style. So I gave this a 4. It's not going to be my best book of the year as I would want it to be to support my boy Keanu, but I did really enjoy it, so a 4 for that one. The next book is How to Be a Dark Lord and Die Trying by Django Wexler. This one is a fantasy novel about a woman who wakes up and there's a wizard there, and he's like, you have to save the world from the Dark Lord. And so she goes and tries to do it, and she gets killed, and she ends up waking up next to that wizard again, and just over and over and over again stuck in this time loop trying to save the world from the Dark Lord. And after about 270 times, she's just like, you know what? Fuck that noise. I'm not gonna be the good guy. I'm gonna become the Dark Lord. And so we follow her as she is amassing allies and trying to make it to this mountain place where they're gonna choose who the next Dark Lord is. I enjoyed this one as a concept. It's so fun. I've definitely been there in a video game where I'm trying to defeat the boss, and I'm like, you know what? I'm so sick of this. Why can't I become the evil villain for once? It was a lot of fun. The overt sexuality of the main character did get a little grating at times because it's very clearly written by a man, and I do have sometimes a little bit of problem when female bisexual characters are written by men. But overall, I did really enjoy this one. It's a fun concept. I'm definitely going to be picking up the sequel in 2025 when that comes out. Next 4 is Skull Daddy by Stephanie Ann. This is an independently published novel about a family where the daughter in the family picks up this like skull Halloween decoration at like a thrift store or something and puts it on her wall. And she just grows really emotionally attached to this skull decoration. She kicks and screams every time they try to take it down the wall. And then also, maybe the skull's possessed by a demon who is trying to get rid of her parents. This one I really enjoyed. It was pretty short. It was a tight narrative. It didn't end the way I thought it was going to end. Really enjoyed this one. A lot of fun with it. Next, and only 4.25, is Horror Movie by Paul Tremblay. This is about a man who was an actor in a horror movie that never ended up getting released because of some very dramatic incident that happened on set. In the current day, people are trying to recreate this movie because it became like a cult classic without even ever being released. So the man who was in the movie originally has been called to like consult on this new remake of it, and you're getting kind of the story of what happened on that initial film set, and then also some things happening in the current with the remake. The format of this one is really fun, especially if you do the audiobook, because there are like table reads, and like the table reads include people like fumbling over words like they would in an actual table read, so it was really fun to read in that format. And there were definitely some twists in here that I didn't expect, so 4.25. Sat through an entire tattoo session just listening to this book, and it helped me get through my longest tattoo session to date, so shout out to Horror Movie, honorable mention for being an enjoyable read while getting a tattoo. Next is I Survived Capitalism, and all I got was this lousy t-shirt by Madeline Pendleton. This is Madeline's memoir about growing up with maybe not the best role models for handling money, and how as an adult she had to basically learn how to deal with money. I read this months ago and gave it a 4.5. When I read it, I didn't enjoy it. She has a very interesting life, especially if you're interested in like LA punk scene. Some good financial tips, especially if you're someone who's looking to start your own business. Moving on, next book, 4.5, Look in the Mirror by Catherine Steadman. This is about a woman whose father dies, and she finds out that he had an island. He owns a house on an island. And so she goes there, and she gets trapped in the basement and has to solve puzzles to escape. And at the same time, there's also a story of another woman who had also been trapped in that basement before, trying to solve puzzles. This is like escape room with very deadly consequences, which I love that as a concept. I really enjoyed this one. It had some good times. I enjoyed the plot. It got a 4.5. It wasn't anything I'm absolutely going to be obsessed with, but I enjoyed it for what it was. 4.5 also for We Used to Live Here by Marcus Kleuer. This is, I would call it subcutanean / House of Leaves for beginners. This is about a woman who's at her brand new house that she bought to fix up and flip, and some random family shows up at her doorstep like, hey, as the father of the family, I used to live here. Can I show my family around? We'll be like 15 minutes tops. And then she doesn't want to say yes, but she does, and then they definitely overstay their welcome, and at the same time, there's these like slips in reality happening. I know that this has a lot more elaborate ARG element to it, which I haven't delved into, but as a book and a book on its own, I really enjoyed this. Given House of Leaves and subcutanean, I love a book that plays with format, that plays with your perception of reality. If you've been intimidated by House of Leaves, read this book, see if that's kind of a vibe and concept you're into, and then you can tackle House of Leaves because it's a similar type of thing. There's some puzzles to solve with like Morse code and stuff like that. It's a lot of fun. Definitely recommend We Used to Live Here. Okay, next is Bride by Ali Hazelwood. This is the vampire novel I mentioned earlier. So this is kind of a world where vampires and werewolves have been at war, and basically to settle the war, the father of this vampire sells her off to be married to a leader of a werewolf pack to try and seal an alliance. I enjoyed this one more than I was expecting to. I love a vampire story, never delved that far into werewolf story, but I was enjoying that. The plot was very interesting. The world building, I was surprised at how complex and interesting it was, given this is a romance novel. I had a good time with this, a 4.75 for Bride. And now we get into the top 5, the best 2024 releases in my opinion. Number 5, The Friendship Study by Ruby Barrett. This is a romance novel about a man who used to be a firefighter but then was injured and had to basically retire, and a woman who used to be a professor at a university in the UK but had a scandal and had to return to her hometown and gets a job basically through nepotism. Both of them having trouble finding friends. So they join a university study called the Friendship Study that basically tries to analyze how adults make friends. And one of the rules of the study is that you are not allowed to be in a romantic relationship with any of the other participants, and guess what happens? So they have to kind of hide their relationship. This is a really good romance novel, and it also delves into some topics like sexuality, ADHD, caring for an aging parent. So there's also a lot here in terms of some really good human elements. Love Ruby Barrett's romance writing, so definitely recommend The Friendship Study. 5th best book of the year. And in 4th place, we have Evil in Me by Brahm. This is about a woman who is on parole in the last week, and then she's free and she can leave. She steals a ring because she's compelled to do so, puts the ring on, and oops, it contained part of a demon and she's now possessed. So she has to try and figure out how to get herself unpossessed with the power of punk rock. I loved this book. It had a little bit of a slow start to it, but after it got going, I was bought in, I was obsessed. I'm still listening to the songs that the Maxines did inspired by this book on a daily basis. So good, and also Brahm's artwork gets me every time. I love this so much, and I definitely recommend picking up this and other Brahm books. 3rd best book of 2024 releases, My Darling Dreadful Thing by Joanna Van Veen. This is about a woman who has basically been forced by her mother to do fake seances, and while the seances are fake, she definitely does have a real ghost that's kind of bonded to her. So one day this other woman comes in for a seance, and turns out that she has a ghost bonded to her. So those two women end up living together, and it's kind of a gothic horror, secrets in the closet type of story, but also sapphic romance. I was not expecting to love this as much as I did. The romantic elements of it were really good. The creepy atmosphere of it was fantastic, and the plot kept me guessing, was so interesting, had bog bodies in it, which I always have found really interesting. So definitely Joanna Van Veen caught me by surprise. Surprising 5-star of the year for me. Next, 2nd best of 2024 is Bury Your Gays by Chuck Tingle. This is about a film producer who is told by the executive of the production company that, yes, you can make your 2 characters gay, but you're gonna have to kill one of them off afterwards, and he refuses. Like, no, I am not doing that. And then different characters from his previous horror movies start coming to life and trying to kill him. And this one, I think, touched on a lot of really important topics about the use of AI in media production, about intellectual property law, and developing technology, and I loved this so much. It also deals with like the implication of gay characters without making them explicitly gay, which happens in media law, and just I loved it. I loved it so much. It was so targeted at me as someone who grew up on Tumblr analyzing scenes of Supernatural, being like, and also as someone who is critical of AI and everything, obsessed, loved it so much. I just also didn't expect some of the twists that happened throughout this. Loved it. Bury Your Gays was so good. But American Rapture wins. American Rapture by CJ Lead is the best 2024 release I read. This is about a teenage girl who is really sheltered in a religious upbringing, you know, showing a little bit of ankle is slutty, and her parents are so overly protective of her that they like don't let her even watch the news, which is inconvenient because there's a plague that's kind of spreading, a flu whose symptoms are being uncontrollably horny. Think zombies, but with sex instead of eating. So she finds out when her parents catch it, she has to flee her home and try to find a safe place and bond with people to figure out how to survive in this new world that is just as overtly sexual as her parents always warned her that it would be, while also deconstructing that some of the things her parents told her, not necessarily true. So I enjoyed this so much. I love a book that's about religious deconstruction. I thought that it was a fun little like twist on a zombie story. I came to care for the characters all so much. Dog that she ends up with, I love this so much. It was so good. I was hesitant to see whether CJ Lead could compete with Mayfly, since that was my best book last year and it was a debut. I was so worried CJ Lead would not be able to keep the energy, but she did. American Rapture was so good. It was the best 2024 release that I read out of the 36 books of 24 that I read, and it didn't even get nominated for the Goodreads Choice Awards. That is my long list and ranking of all of the 2024 releases I read, other than graphic novels. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like and consider subscribing. Let me know in the comments down below what the best 2024 release you read was, or leave the dog emoji for the dog in American Rapture. There are links to my Instagram and my Goodreads down below if you want to follow what I'm reading throughout the month. Thank you so much for watching and have a great day.